Pro-abortion protesters disrupted the Respect Life Mass at St. Joseph's Cathedral in downtown Columbus, Ohio. Bishop Robert Brennan was presiding at the event, marking the 48th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. Protesters stormed into the sanctuary carrying signs. The signs read, "Fund abortion, not cops," and "Abortion on demand. End Hyde now." Some of them shouted 2468, "This church teaches hate." The protesters were escorted out by local police and diocesan staff. In his first 2 weeks in office, President Biden has signed executive orders touching on gender and promising to repeal protections for the unborn. What will be the fallout of the president's new executive orders, and what might the administration do next when it comes to life and gender? For answers, we're joined by visiting fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and writer at National Review, ALEXANDRA DeSANCTIS, and author of the upcoming book, Awake, Not Woke, Noelle Mering. Thank you both for being with us. Biden has made it clear that he will rescind the Mexico City policy. Now, this prohibits U.S. funding of foreign organizations that promote or perform abortions. Now, we've seen this policy flip back and forth from Republican to Democrat since Ronald Reagan announced it in '84. What are the real consequences of this? Alexandra, I'll start with you.
You know, this is a really big policy change. This is something that President Trump, in fact, expanded under his administration. He sort of increased the pot of U.S. foreign aid money that was covered by the Mexico City policy, meaning even more U.S. aid was forbidden from covering abortion overseas. This is a huge deal. This means now, once Biden flips it back, U.S. aid money will once again be going from the State Department, USAID, all these other groups, to groups that either perform abortions abroad or promote them. So this means groups like the International Planned Parenthood Group, Marie Stopes International, which has since been renamed. These sorts of groups will be getting U.S. funding. Again, U.S. taxpayers are indirectly underwriting abortions or groups that promote abortion all around the world.
On Tuesday, 197 House Republicans sent a letter to House and Senate leaders of both parties in support of the Hyde Amendment. Now, I knew Henry Hyde. He attached this to appropriation bills to prohibit federal funding of abortions. Now, after long support for Hyde, Biden has said he's going to do away with the Hyde Amendment. And Speaker Nancy Pelosi, she said she would not attach it to the 2022 spending bills. For a pair of Catholics, this is pretty stunning. Noelle, your take on this. Why this advocacy for abortion? It's not only passively accepting something that's out there, but these are two Catholics, Pelosi and Biden, advancing the cause here and funding it.
Right. It's beyond personal disagreement, right? They're asking for us all to be implicated and also to promulgate this across the globe with the Mexico City policy in a way that, oftentimes is offensive to the indigenous people who have sensibilities that are not wanting to be ideologically colonized in this way. So Biden's in a pickle, right? Because surely he knows that this is not a mere policy issue. Abortion itself is not. It's not like economic policy or immigration policy where people can prudentially disagree. Abortion is a fundamental principle that, in violation of human dignity, the Catholic Church that he professes stands strongly against, and there's no room for disagreement there. So his response, through his press secretary on this matter, was deeply concerning and is bizarre non sequitur. When asked about it, she replied about him that he is a devout Catholic and he goes to Mass. So, first and foremost, that's not addressing the actual question, which is how does he reconcile this and what will the policy look like? But rather, it's sort of reflecting this excessive privatization of religion to become totally relativistic. Where religion has no place to say anything on moral ground, has no truth to promote because it's divorced from reason and divorced from the common good. And that's a nice shield. But if you think about it in a different light, for example, if a president was supporting slavery and when asked about it, he said, "Well, I'm a devout Catholic," that would be galling, to say the least. To be able to separate these things and to somehow think that that's the new Christian left.
Alexandra, why didn't the Republicans codify Hyde into law when they had the chance? They had both houses of Congress and the White House. Why didn't Paul Ryan do this?
I think, honestly, this is an issue where Republicans didn't realize perhaps how radical the left was becoming on this issue. It was only just in 2016 that the Democratic Party, for the first time, put into their party platform the desire to federally fund abortions for low-income women through Medicaid and Medicare. And, I think Republicans probably thought, look, this has been a bipartisan compromise for so long, for decades now. Democrats routinely vote for spending bills that have the Hyde Amendment. In fact, President Barack Obama in his budget proposal included the Hyde Amendment. So this was something, there's been a bit of contention about it, but by and large, there's been bipartisan support for this policy for a long time, because it's really more about conscience rights than it is about abortion as such. And I think they probably made a mistake in assuming or not noticing perhaps how quickly the left was beginning to radicalize on the issue.
Mm-hmm. Ladies, in a recent panel discussion, Sister Simone Campbell, who's a progressive advocate, said that the political obsession with outlawing abortion has broken the church apart. She said this about Biden's approach to life and abortion. Listen.
He has I know from a conversation with him, he has a very developed approach to it. And for him, it hinges on religious liberty, and that he will not force his religious belief on the whole nation.
Have you ever heard the idea, well, he has a very developed approach to child abuse? I mean, is this sustainable from a moral perspective? Noelle, I'll go to you.
Certainly not. I mean, this is the problem, is that the severe injustice of introducing abortion into law has created a rupture where there is no harmony to ultimately be had. We can sort of patch over it with conscious rights, which are important. But ultimately, the left, this is the crux of the sexual revolution. It's the backstop that allows the sexual revolution to be propped up. You remove abortion, and then they expose the folly of the whole revolution. So they have to keep this in place. So to call that a developed policy is bizarre, and also to say that it's for the sake of religious liberty is very bizarre, given that this really is something that's going to erase religious liberty ultimately, either through the attacks on conscious rights and what we've seen happening to the Little Sisters of the Poor and Christian colleges. So it's a little bit backwards, but that's sort of what the left MO is, right? Is that they call what is love hate and what is hate love. And so this is sort of consistent with that ideological problem.
Yeah, well, Noelle, I was going to ask you about that. How does this idea of religious liberty extend to the contraceptive mandate, gender, teaching the science when it comes to gender? I mean, isn't all of what we're seeing out of this administration so far, isn't this all imposing views, moral views on society?
Absolutely, and that's a fundamental problem. Is I think that they prey upon the American citizens' desire to be, not a bigot and to be compassionate to people, but they take that natural and good desire and they twist it by saying that, this is just a movement for the sake of including this small group of people who deserve our compassion. They certainly do deserve our compassion, but that's not actually what the movement is saying. It's an ideological bomb that is forcing all of us, or trying to force all of us, to disorient and disrupt any whole understanding of human personhood and human dignity, a bodily dignity. And once they want us to think that we can be anything in order to say that we can be nothing. And that's ultimately what's at the end of this road, is a total nihilism where the body means nothing. And it's consistent with the sexual revolution, which has been telling us for years that our body has no meaning other than what we choose to give it.
Speaking of gender, I want to move on to this executive order banning discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. President Biden signed it this week. Now, this order will extend federal non-discrimination protections to members of the LGBT community, including sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression as well. Now, this executive order essentially allows biological men who identify as women to compete in women's sports, etc., and vice versa. What are the implications here? Alexandra, I'll start with you and then to Noelle.
I think this is a really difficult issue because it's clear here where the kind of coalitions within the progressive movement are on a collision course. You have on one hand feminists who are saying women's rights are so important and women's privacy and women's bodily autonomy. And then on the other hand, you have activists who are insisting that to respect the rights and dignity of individuals who identify as transgender or as the opposite sex, we must kind of remake our norms in public institutions to kind of fit their idea of self or the conception of their gender. Those two things cannot coexist when the policies you're demanding are to let biological men onto girls' sports teams or to let them into locker rooms or bathrooms or girls' dorm rooms. And the logical extension of such a policy is exactly that. It's that colleges, regardless of perhaps their religious affiliation or what have you, even just their judgment, now can no longer have sex segregated spaces. And I think it's pretty clear that there are good reasons to do so, not the least of which are women's rights to safe spaces, to privacy, and to, I think, girls especially have a right to compete, or if not a right, they should be able to expect they can compete against people who are similar athletic ability. And simply, they're just not going to be able to do that if biological men are permitted to compete against them.
Noelle, I've heard arguments where people say, look, these are people who are suffering from some sort of dysphoria. They're going through a transition here, and this is fair. This is the government saying we're leveling the playing field. You would say what?
Well, I think it's fair that we should treat them with great dignity and compassion. The thing that's not fair is that we don't want to exist outside of reality, right? And, as for all the talk of following the science, this is biological science that we all know intuitively. Even as children, you understand what is a boy and what is a girl. So while, the person who's suffering this dysphoria should be given all the compassion and help and aid that they need, I think to help them in that deception and to convince all of us that this is the right thing to do is ultimately going to be the downfall of great things in our culture, because we really cannot sustain a lie like that. And the Catholic Church is called to think with reality, ultimately, with science, with reality, with philosophical principles and theological ones. But these things are all cohesive. And once you rupture those things, then as Alexandra said, you start having the movement turn against itself. It starts to eat upon itself. And that's what you see happening with the feminists and the transgender rights people right now, is that these things cannot be harmonious because they're fundamentally not in a harmonious ideology.
Mm-hmm. What about boys? I mean, we've seen the dismantling of organizations like Boy Scouts of America as a result of this gender ideology. Alexandra, where does this go? What's the next step here?
I think it does, in fact, cut both ways. You're right. I tend to think of it in terms of how this could harm girls and women because of the obvious biological disparities between men and women if you're putting biological men into female spaces. But it does cut against men as well. For instance, could you have any longer a single-sex college? Could boys have any space that belongs just to them? The idea that a girl could be part of Boy Scouts just changes the nature of the organization, changes what men are participating in. And I think, obviously, the genders are complementary and both need each other, but we can see as a society it's important to have spaces where one can exist without the other for different purposes. And I think the end of this road is, unfortunately, that those spaces are going to have to be either erased or altered pretty fundamentally.
Mm-hmm. Noelle, I want to talk for a second about the wider reach of this gender ideology, these theories that we're seeing move into public policy. I mean, we saw Speaker Nancy Pelosi introducing gender-neutral language in the new rules of Congress a couple of weeks ago, and now the Biden administration has asked staff to choose their personal pronouns. How does this move into everyday life? Is this just going to become the default all across society?
Well, I think that's certainly what they want. And I think that the only way that we fight against that is by having the courage to not go along with it. Because the only way that, this is an ideology that's fundamentally a lie. The only way that a lie is sustained is by silencing opposition. So, that's why you see when somebody is confident that they are expressing something that's true and that's for the common good and for the good of all people, they're not afraid of dissent and disagreement. And I think that's why we're seeing so much fear and silencing right now. It's because they know that it's sort of a house of cards. But it is also a Trojan horse. So once you insert this ideology with these, gender neutral pronouns, you really start to have people swallow a whole host of lies that they don't understand that they're swallowing, that have far-reaching meaning about the human person and the dignity of the person. And once you dismantle that understanding, then you end up being able to instrumentalize the human person in ways that are quite scary, and there's a lot of precedent for being wary of this road.
This past March, a United Nations report addressed gender-based violence and discrimination. It criticized, quote, religious interest groups and individuals who invoke religious tenets as well as pseudoscience to defend traditional values about social roles of men and women and to oppose gender ideology in ways that intimidate or stigmatize critics. Now, in response to this, Archbishop Ivan Jurkovic, the Vatican observer at the UN agencies in Geneva, said particularly unacceptable and offensive are the numerous references that recommend that freedom of religion or belief and conscientious objection must be surrendered for the promotion of other so-called human rights, which certainly do not enjoy consensus, thus being a sort of ideological colonization on the part of some states and international institutions. I want both of you to reflect on this pitting of religious freedom against this gender redefinition. What do you expect here in the United States from this administration in the days ahead? And are we going to see more of this collision of rights and values here? Alexandra, I'll start with you.
You know, I think, unfortunately, what we're going to see in the realm of gender and gender ideology is very similar to what we've seen with abortion. And what you mentioned that quote from Sister Simone Campbell earlier, I think on abortion, the left has managed to sort of implicate religion in the pro-life movement in such a way where they can dismiss opposition to abortion or dismiss pro-life views as just this kind of old, outdated religious view. And if you say you're pro-life or you oppose abortion, you must just be kind of a weird religious person and you can't impose your values on us. This is exactly what Joe Biden is trying to do to cover for, being supposedly a devout Catholic and also pushing unlimited abortion funded by the taxpayer. And I think we're seeing the exact same effort happening when it comes to gender and what it means to be human. And you don't have to be religious or Catholic to understand that men and women are separate, distinct types of people, right? That it's different to be a man, it's different to be a woman. We can know what those categories are. And that's something fundamental about what it means to be human. Sex and gender are real defined categories, biologically speaking. And so if we're going to erase that, I think a huge part of the left's strategy is going to be to characterize as an imposition of religious views the idea that sex and gender have any meaning other than whatever we feel like making them.
Noelle, this has implications, no doubt, on Catholic and religious institutions that teach the natural law, that sex is a binary biological characteristic of the human person. What kind of backlash do you foresee here for those institutions?
Well, it seems almost like the ceiling's too high, right? Because once you do away with a common understanding of natural law, then what authority do you have to keep you in check, right? The natural law is inherently something that all people are under and have to respect in order to have any sort of moral framework. So once you take that off, it becomes quickly something that becomes all about human power. So I think that from their perspective, there's not much road that they wouldn't go down as far as this ideology goes. And the thing that will be a limiting principle will be the American citizens pushing back against it and finally saying, no, I won't be intimidated and told that I'm a bigot by acknowledging things that are basic matters of science and biology. And that doesn't mean that I'm not compassionate. It just means that science matters and biology matters and reality matters. And it's not helpful for our country or our culture to deny those things. And secondarily, the natural law, that we have to have principles in order to sustain any sort of moral norms. And once you let go of those principles, then you walk down a road of consequentialism. And this is a very dangerous road. So I just think that we have to understand that our natural instincts and our common sense and our innate understanding of consciousness, our conscience, are things that are really in our favor, and we have nature on our side. So all we have to do is not be afraid, I think, and bullied by these tactics that are really tactics of a demagogue.
Well, as my friend Father Richard Newhouse would say, this is a Catholic moment. I mean, this is a moment when the Church is challenged and needs to rise up and clearly articulate the truth. I mean, I've read a lot of commentary in the past week from Catholic writers, presumably or avowedly, and they say that there was a theocracy that was being, neoconservative theocracy that was being pushed earlier. If they're trying to label what, the 80s and 90s as that, well, then this is clearly a relativistocracy underway here, where we have everybody pushes their agenda and wraps it in a religious gauze or a religious trapping. Alexandra DeSantis, Noelle Mering, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.